Well, thanks everyone for, we're almost there, almost at the end. My name is Andrea Peterson, and I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I am going to be moderating the panel on anxiety. And I'm just giving a little intro first. First, I wanted to just read a couple of brief quotes from Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety. Then the assaults of anxiety, even though they be terrifying, will not be such that he flees from them. For him, anxiety becomes a serving spirit that against its will leads him where he wishes to go. And as someone who writes about anxiety from a psychopathology point of view, this is a kind of a revelatory concept that I've been thinking a lot more about. But the key, as Kierkegaard says later, is that it seems to be cultivating the right amount or type of anxiety. And he goes on to say, I will say that this is an adventure that every human being must go through to learn to be anxious in order that he may not perish either by never having been in anxiety or by succumbing in anxiety. Whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate. And so how can we be anxious in the right way so anxiety can fuel purpose, creativity, and action? And how do we keep it from tipping over to something that is confining and indeed paralyzing? In my work at the Wall Street Journal, writing on anxiety, as I said, I deal mostly as psychopathology. And I spend my time talking to psychiatrists and psychologists who treat people where anxiety is really a prison. About 40 million American adults, about 18% of the population, at one point or another, are diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. There are 12 different anxiety disorders in the DSM, which is the sort of handbook for psychiatric diagnosis. Obsessive compulsive disorder, specific phobia, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, a lot of fun sounding afflictions. Anti-anxiety medications, these are the benzodiazepines like Klonopin and Xanax, are the most commonly prescribed psychiatric drugs, beating out antidepressants like Prozac and Zoloft, and sleeping pills like Ambien. There were 93.7 million prescriptions written for benzodiazepines in 2011, up 17% since 2006. So there's clearly a lot of people out there trying to find some safe haven from their anxiety. I recently attended a big scientific meeting that brought together the top researchers on anxiety. There was little discussion of the philosophical and emotional underpinning of anxiety. In fact, I can't think of any. And a major reason for that, I believe, is because of two huge scientific advances: the mapping of the genome and advances in brain imaging. Now scientists have identified more than a dozen genes that predispose a person to crippling anxiety. With PET scans, researchers are homing in on the parts of the brain that seem to go haywire. A hair trigger amygdala, the seat of the fight or flight response, a weaker connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, a relationship key to fears unraveling. Researchers can identify temperament, so-called behaviorally inhibited, in babies as young as 4 months old. This temperament raises the risk of anxiety problems by 4-fold. These babies cry at novel sounds, their muscles stiffen when looking at unfamiliar faces, and some clinicians are treating toddlers with this behaviorally inhibited temperament with cognitive behavioral therapy to try to prevent the later development of anxiety disorders. The hope, of course, is that this new knowledge will lead to better treatments and alleviate human suffering. But has the pendulum swung too far? Are we losing something in looking at anxiety as almost solely a genetic legacy, a problem of brain structure, and the misfiring of neurons? I'm guessing Kierkegaard, and probably a lot of people here would say yes. The interesting thing is that one of the most effective treatments for anxiety disorders is one that I believe Kierkegaard would probably nod in approval. It is exposure therapy, and it involves literally facing what one fears. A person with an elevator phobia, for example, would basically face the fear incrementally. In the first treatment, he or she would walk up to an elevator. The second treatment, he or she would press the button. Another treatment, they would walk in. They would go up one floor. Eventually, they would be able to ride up an elevator without disabling fear. The kind of therapy was in its infancies in the 1970s, so Kierkegaard was 150 years ahead of his time. I want to introduce the panel. Heather Ohaneson, who will graduate from Columbia in 2 weeks with her PhD in the philosophy of religion, congratulations, will be discussing Kierkegaard's use of pseudonyms and its relation to the creation of avatars in online role-playing games. Did I get that right? And the artist Richard Tuttle will discuss the notion of good anxiety I'm looking forward to that. And Robert Kiernan, who researches socially responsible investing, will discuss Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety and its relevance in motivating entrepreneurs. Heather, thanks.
So my fondness for Kierkegaard and my respect for all of you make it a true honor to participate in the celebration today. For better or worse, our enthusiasm in this day-long conference does not hold a candle to the 11 straight days of observance that WQXR afforded Bach for the composer's 328th birthday this March, playing every note that Sebastian wrote. So you might be getting off easy with only a few hours of attention to the melancholy Dean. Incidentally, Karl Marx was also born on May 5th. He is 5 years Kierkegaard's junior to the day. This fact somehow makes the curious coupling of the Columbia Department of Religion and the Columbia Center on Capitalism and Society in the co-sponsorship of this event all the more interesting. I have given a name to my talk, gathering these brief comments under the title Performing or Performance Anxiety, Kierkegaard's Role-Playing Games. For the next few minutes, I will address Kierkegaard's pseudonymous authorship in terms of anxiety, of course, given the section at which we have arrived, and probably less obviously in terms of avatar creation in massively multiplayer online role-playing games, a relatively recent phenomenon in play. The question to which I'm going to build is whether the public distancing of himself from himself that Kierkegaard performs or affects in publishing text under pseudonyms is at all similar to the testing out of identities that goes on in contemporary online forms of play. To begin then, let us rehearse a few of the aspects and interpretations of Kierkegaard's choice to write through figures such as Johannes de Silencio, the seeker of faith behind Fear and Trembling, the humorist Johannes Climacus of Philosophical Fragments and the concluding unscientific postscript, and Anti-Climacus, on whom Kierkegaard hangs sickness unto death. After a cursory discussion of the possible function and motivation of the pseudonymous writings, which are referred to as the first authorship in contrast to the supposedly direct communication of the second authorship of Kierkegaard's religious writings, we will turn to the mechanics and significance of crafting an avatar. Finally, we will be in a position to bring the two types of playful acts of individuation into consideration together. So section 1, possible function and motivation. Kierkegaard, we know, was an anxious man. For example, he expected to die before turning 34, convinced that the sins of the father would visit him, the son. Apparently, when he did live to see 1847, he consulted the parish records to verify his birthday. Or take the pithy confession recorded in Garth's recent and magisterial biography of the religious poet. In that recognizable voice, Kierkegaard says, "All of existence makes me anxious, from the least little fly to the mysteries of the incarnation." The function of the pseudonyms, however, was not to relieve Kierkegaard's own anxiety. All of the layers of literary dissimulation were in service of the reader's interests, of their journey to selfhood instead. Thus, William MacDonald, using the language of play, writes, quote, "All of this play with narrative points of view, with contrasting works, and with contrasting internal partitions within individual works, leaves the reader very disoriented. In combination with the incessant play of irony and Kierkegaard's predilection for paradox and semantic opacity, the text becomes a polished surface for the reader in which the prime meaning to be discerned is the reader's own reflection." Kierkegaard's method of indirect communication was designed to sever the reliance of the reader on the authority of the author and on the received wisdom of the community. The reader was to be forced to take individual responsibility for knowing who she is and for knowing where she stands on the existential, ethical, and religious issues raised in the texts, end quote. These lines echo Mark Taylor's own statements about Kierkegaard's motivation for pseudonymous publication. In Kierkegaard's pseudonymous authorship, he argues that Kierkegaard's concern is with the reader's existence rather than his own. Kierkegaard's ready willingness to displace rather than display marks of his own subjectivity in his literary production is surprising to me. I might have expected him to attempt to be a guide, after all, inviting something like imitation on the part of his dear readers. Kierkegaard's embodying of different points of view makes more sense, however, in the light of his criticism of his contemporary Hans Christian Andersen. Again, I turn to the biographer Garf, who shares, although during the same year of 1838, Kierkegaard remarked in his journal that, quote, an author always ought to give something of his personality, just as Christ feeds us with his body and blood, unquote, Hans Christian Andersen had gone too far, for he had not succeeded in maintaining the requisite distance from his literary work, and consequently he had gradually become enmeshed in it. Indeed, in Andersen's, and here again he quotes Kierkegaard, in Andersen's novels, indeed, Andersen's novels stand in so physical a relation to his own self that their genesis can be seen less as his productions than as amputations of his self, unquote. That last quotation, that Andersen's novels may be seen as amputations of his self, reveals a distinctly Kierkegaardian wit that is simultaneously clever and judgmental. Kierkegaard's refusal to create fragments of philosophy out of amputations of self is oddly of a piece with the disembodying self in virtual play. So I will turn now to section 2 on the mechanics and the significance of creating or crafting an avatar. My comments on avatars will be in reference to character creation in a particularly massively multiplayer online role-playing game, that of World of Warcraft. Popularized by the 2009 James Cameron movie of the same title, the word avatar had already entered the gaming parlance in 1985 through the computer game Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar. It began to take hold more strongly in 1986 when F. Randall Farmer and Chip Morningstar, the creators of the networked game Lucasfilm Habitat, used it to refer to one's online persona. In choosing the word, Morningstar likened the player to a deity. As Farmer recounted to the wordsmith journalist Aaron Britt, quote, back then, pre-internet, you had to call a number with your telephone and then set it back into the cradle. You were reaching out into this game quite literally through a silver strand. The avatar was the incarnation of a deity, the player in the online world. We liked the idea of the puppet master controlling his puppet, but instead of using strings, he was using a telephone line, end quote. The incarnational sense of the word avatar comes from its Sanskrit meaning. In Hindu myth, Avatra refers to a god's descent and earthly manifestation, particularly that of Vishnu. And Jesper Juhl, a professor at the NYU Game Center, recently reminded me that Jesus was an avatar too. Taking on the identity of a virtual avatar is, by contrast, decarnational. Adopting an avatar is how players virtualize themselves. If taking on flesh is how a deity can appear on Earth, being in-avatared is how a person shows up online, sans material body. Building an avatar and adopting it as a role are essential aspects to playing World of Warcraft. The process of representing himself online requires the gamer to make decisions, the ethical and psychological implications of which may be unclear to him. Abstracting, we may say that avatars can reveal us to others online, even as they hide us from ourselves. At the same time, however, it may be the case that avatars provide the cover necessary to make our real identity known to ourselves and others. The ambiguity of play means that a gamer may delve more deeply into selfhood, gaining a better sense of who he is for having escaped into the imagined sphere of World of Warcraft. A further incongruity is found in the liability of the balance of power to tip between an avatar and its animator. When this occurs, boundaries break and Frankenstein-like transformations result. What was once under control and contained in the game world seeps out into the real world in undesirable ways in a counter-escape, as it were. Imagine what it might mean for one of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous characters, Vigilius Hafnianus, the watchman of Copenhagen, the author of The Concept of Anxiety, for example, to break free and overtake Kierkegaard's personality. Sometimes we play the roles, and sometimes the roles play us. We get played. The dual nature of MMORPGs asserts itself yet again as these enterprises are seen to be both salutary and harmful. Over and against the danger of deleterious real-world effects are the numerous pleasures that adopting an avatar can afford during the play. An avatar may hold the promise of anonymity, quoting here the MIT scholar Sherry Turkle. Once Peter creates his character, that is his only identity in the game, unquote, as well as the appeal of autonomy, and here I quote the player, Mark Meadows. When someone slips into an avatar, he slips into the ability to be competent, end quote. Leaving aside the issue of ambiguity of change because of time, the elements I care to highlight in the following description of World of Warcraft avatars are choice and flexibility of identity. So after providing data and dollars by logging on and signing up, a person is ready to craft her online in-game self. The first choice that a World of Warcraft gamer has to exercise in creating an avatar is the group to which she will belong. There are two sides, the Alliance and the Horde. The decision of the allegiance is significant but not final. On the one hand, being a member of the Alliance opens up some possibilities but forecloses others. There are certain traits and tasks that belong exclusively to the Alliance, and conversely, some that are available only to the Horde. On the other hand, the determination of attributes does not have to feel restrictive because players can have multiple avatars. That is, a player does not have to commit to any single option, but can experience the game from a range of avatar perspectives. Yes, avatar perspectives. One must select for gender, male or female, race, for which there are 8 options, or in the expanded edition of the game, 12, and class, for which there are 11 possibilities. Later, after having accumulated points, one exercises choice in how to apply the reward tokens to the increase in avatar talents, that is, in deciding which areas to assign new strengths. That this process of building an avatar involves customization seems very much in line with contemporary consumer expectations. You are not constrained to play a role that someone else determines for you. It is up to you to select which features and facilities, orc or human, goblin or gnome, warrior or warlock, are yours, unless you would prefer otherwise. Even the option of opting out of customization is accounted for. The World of Warcraft game guide states, quote, if you're in a hurry, you can use the randomize button and the game will generate a few random configurations until you see one you like, end quote. The World of Warcraft designers understand that like work schedules, our leisure time may be harried. The flexibility of identity in World of Warcraft is striking. This is not to deny that people may form emotional attachments to their avatars or that they may choose to play one role consistently. Indeed, studies report people's serious investment in characters that are carefully developed. It is even common for someone who plays a single character repeatedly over a long period to express grief when the character meets demise and the role comes to an end. But it is worth pausing even momentarily and reflecting on the significance of the possible fluidity of identity in this game world. As a player, you do not have to limit yourself to one avatar. You may experiment with the many different character possibilities at your disposal. If one avatar ceases to excite or please you, switch to another. So time necessitates a rather hasty turn to concluding comparisons, and so in section 3, I will ask, would Kierkegaard philosophize through avatars if he were writing today? Or what type of game designer would Kierkegaard be? In conversations over my dissertation, Mark Taylor has suggested rather provocatively that if Kierkegaard were alive today, he would dispense with the book form and offer his social critique from within the contemporary aesthetic medium of video games. Mark maintains that rather than employing pseudonymous authors, Kierkegaard would allow people to imagine themselves into various ways of life, but also would level criticism against 21st century modes of being through digitized characters. In entering into this arena of reflection, we stop asking about which roles we perform. The distinction between performance anxiety and performing anxiety fades. We refrain now from even asking why we cycle through identities. We begin to think instead about the how of pretense, thinking about whether the video game is as good a canvas for existential picturing as literature, if it is more successful a means of self-examination in that it allows players to visualize and enact fantastic deeds. This turns into the question of the limit of philosophy. What counts as philosophical? What is the relationship finally not between anxiety and authorship or anxiety and play, but between anxiety and philosophy? Thank you.
So there are three parts to my remarks this afternoon. The first is an exegetical review of anxiety, as Kierkegaard used it in the concept of anxiety, with some further references to sickness unto death and some parts of either or, which will try to assert the claim that anxiety is key to discovering the core of Kierkegaard's taciturn metaphysical commitment to freedom. The second part concerns the implications of this reading of Kierkegaard's meaning of anxiety for the understanding of freedom, which, I will argue, prefigures a far more well-read and well-recited understanding of freedom articulated by Isaiah Berlin in his notion of positive freedom in the two concepts of liberty. Indeed, so closely prefigures it that it is surprising that Berlin did not acknowledge a debt to Kierkegaard. Third, and briefly, I will suggest that we ought to consider parallels between both Joseph Schumpeter's description of the entrepreneur to what Professor Taylor would call Kierkegaard's wayfarer on the stages of life's way, and between Frank Knight's notion of uncertainty and Kierkegaard's notion of anxiety, because they might lead to a better understanding of the role of the entrepreneur and the place of uncertainty in our ongoing pursuit of a more meaningful and improved human science of economics, a pursuit that existentially defines the Center for Capitalism on Society. To start with Cartesian anxiety is to frame this talk in a way that Richard Bernstein might have framed it in his 1983 book, Beyond Objectivism and Relativism, where he defined Cartesian anxiety. The purpose of starting here is twofold. First, to remind ourselves that Kierkegaard, despite his highly unorthodox writing style, was extremely well versed in the history of philosophy, the significance of Descartes' role and legacy in introducing modernity as a philosophical problem, and relatedly, Kant's role and legacy in perfecting the notion of autonomy. Secondly, Bernstein reminds us that the social sciences, in particular, continue to grapple with Cartesian anxiety even to this day, which is what rightly draws the Center on Capitalism and Society into philosophical questions when trying to realize its mission more generally and to sponsor a conference like this today. Cartesian anxiety, Bernstein writes, is caused by Descartes' demand that we should not rely on unfounded opinions, prejudices, traditions, or external authorities, but only on the authority of reason itself. Bernstein finds the primary source of Descartes' demands in the Meditations, which, interestingly, Descartes wrote in the format of a journey of the soul, or what Bernstein calls a meditative reflection on human finitude through which we gradually deepen and understand what it really means to be limited, finite creatures who are completely dependent on an all-powerful, beneficent, perfect, and infinite God. But Descartes' journey of the soul is at once terrifying and liberating. Terrifying in the sense that Descartes defines it as all of a sudden having fallen into very deep water, where I can neither make certain of setting my feet on the bottom, nor can I swim so as to support myself on the surface. And liberating because I can free myself from the dread, fear, and anxiety if I set aside all the doubts and confess that the one life of man is frequently subject to error in respect to individual objects. And we must, in the end, acknowledge the infirmity of our nature. The infirmity of our nature. It wouldn't surprise anyone who's been in the room all day that these words could have been attributed to Kierkegaard. But Bernstein's point is that the root of the Cartesian anxiety is a search and a quest for foundations, the grounding of our ontological and epistemological and even spiritual understanding and knowledge. The choices of foundation that Bernstein says characterize late 20th century theorizing are divided between objectivists who would have the vision that who have the belief that there are or must be some fixed permanent constraints to which we can appeal and which are secure and stable. And relativists who claim that objectivism is invariably a sophisticated form of ethnocentrism in which some privileged understanding of rationality is falsely legitimatized by a claim to unwarranted universality. But Bernstein does not seek to evaluate the relative merits of either objectivists or relativists. Rather, he seeks to transcend the debate by exorcising the Cartesian anxiety altogether, an argument he develops with an original combination of Habermas, Gadamer, and Reuter. But Bernstein characterizes our age as post-empirical, post-positivist, post-modern, and post-structural. yet admits that our theorizing continues to be fraught by many of the same problems of modernity that Kierkegaard grappled with and sought to transcend in his own day, which again makes Kierkegaard especially relevant to the mission of the center. Turning to the concept of anxiety, most of us, or at least those who are as old as I am, originally read the concept of anxiety as the concept of dread, as it was translated by Walter Lowry. Indeed, Professor Taylor has written that dread better captures the terrifying dimensions of the experience that Kierkegaard was describing. I assume since he's approved the program, that it's okay to carry on to talk about it as anxiety for the rest of the day. There are other writings where Kierkegaard also uses the term of anxiety before we get to the concept of anxiety. For example, in Either Or, he writes, "Anxiety is the means by which the subject appropriates his sorrow and assimilates it, going on to liken sorrow as the relationship of a lover to his beloved, both through fear and love." It also appears in his journals, where he writes, "Anxiety is a desire for what one fears, a sympathetic antipathy. Anxiety is an alien power which grips the individual, yet one cannot tear himself free from it and does not want to, for one fears, but he fears what he desires." We'll see this formulation again in the concept of anxiety. In the concept of anxiety, our author, Vigilius Hafniensis, the watchman of the harbor, and watchman is, I believe, is an avatar, is a comic character, right? So the watchman of Copenhagen being the harbor city, tells us that he'll address what is essentially a scientific topic, but it's related to a dogmatic topic. Hence the subtitle, "A Simple Psychologically Orienting Deliberation on the Dogmatic Issue of Hereditary Sin." Vigilius writes, "The present work has as its task the psychological treatment of the concept of anxiety, but in such a way that it consistently keeps in mente and before its eye the dogma of hereditary sin. Accordingly, it must, though tacitly, deal with the concept of sin." Close quote. Early in the text, Vigilius tells us something that might seem antithetical to Kierkegaard when he writes, "Each individual has the same perfection. Precisely because of this, individuals do not fall apart from one another numerically." And further, "Through the first sin, sin came into the world. Precisely in the same way, it is true that every subsequent man's first sin, that through it, sin comes into the world. That it was not in the world before Adam's sin is, in relation to sin itself, something entirely accidental and irrelevant. It is of no significance at all and cannot justify making Adam's sin greater or the first sin of every other man lesser." This is an innovative treatment of original sin by Kierkegaard. But it doesn't necessarily explain man's fall from innocence. For an account of that fall, Vigilius explains that every man is a synthesis of the psychical and the physical. That includes both a body and a mind, a future and a past, possibilities and necessities, finitude and infinitude. The synthesis is affected by a third concept, which Vigilius calls the spirit, or the power of the will to self-consciously relate the two elements together in synthesis to one another and thereby to find one's self. In the innocent man, the spirit is merely dreaming. But the future for the innocent man who is dreaming is nothingness. And this nothingness of future possibilities first manifests itself as anxiety, which eventually demands the innocent to take a choice. Understood in this way, anxiety has both an attractive and a repulsive nature. Vigilius writes that anxiety is a sympathetic antipathy and an antipathetic sympathy, extending on the definition from Either Or. He exemplifies this case of a man looking over the edge of a precipice and simultaneously experiencing the fear of falling and the desire to jump. It is also, he notes, precisely what Adam was attracted to in the fruit, yet repelled by because the fruit was forbidden. Another way of phrasing this is to state that anxiety makes possibility possible, and hence makes freedom actual, for where there is no possibility, there is no freedom. And yet it also simultaneously makes the possibility of unfreedom possible, whence the ambiguity embedded in anxiety. It is important here that Vigilius distinguishes anxiety from sin itself and anxiety from the necessity or the cause of sin. He argues that anxiety is the condition for the possibility of choice. It is likewise important that he distinguishes between fear and anxiety, as fear deals with something specifically, while the object of anxiety is something that is nothing, because the possibility is not yet a thing. But this is only Vigilius's introduction to the concept of anxiety, as well as his explanation for the universality of original sin. In the third chapter of the concept of anxiety, Vigilius differentiates three separate forms of anxiety. Having already explained that the self is the synthesis of the body and the soul, or the ontological and the normative, which are willfully sustained by synthesis in spirit, he now observes that the spirit creates an obligation to achieve the synthesis of self, and the object of that synthesis, a possibility that lies before us. The spirit which seeks to sustain the self as a synthesis of body and mind, future and past, possibility and necessity, finitude and infinitude, is a self that is both what it is and what it seeks to be. This double meaning of self, that which is and that which ought to be, implies a task which must be taken up. The failure to take up this task is a condition that Vigilius calls spiritlessness, which is the first kind of anxiety that he describes in this chapter. Spiritlessness is the failure to recognize that one's task is to achieve selfhood, or that one's failure to acknowledge the future. The spiritless human being, however, does not recognize the anxiety of spiritlessness, as he does not recognize his future. Therefore, Vigilius says, from the standpoint of spirit, anxiety is also present in spiritlessness, but it is hidden and disguised. The second form of anxiety Vigilius describes is the anxiety of fate. He uses the example of Napoleon to explain how certain historically exceptional people, he refers to them as geniuses, are beholden to fate, which can either treat them kindly or tragically. He sees this kind of anxiety very clearly in Greek tragedy. Finally, he describes a third kind of anxiety that he calls the anxiety of guilt. The anxiety of guilt, he claims, is typified by the religion and culture of Judaism. He writes, as freedom, with all its passion, wishfully stares at itself, and would keep guilt at a distance, so that not a single particle might be found in freedom, it cannot refrain from staring at guilt. And this staring is the ambiguous staring of anxiety, just as renunciation, within the possibility of itself, is a coveting. Vigilius differentiates the anxiety of guilt from the anxiety of choice, which he initially described as Adam's choice, because in the future, the instance of the anxiety of guilt is not known, but rather it's not unknown, but rather concrete. He writes, guilt is a more concrete conception which becomes more and more possible in the relation of the possibility of freedom. We can restate this as the anxiety of guilt is the simultaneous attraction to and repulsion from the possibility of guilt. Vigilius is careful to inform the reader that each of these three types of anxiety can be associated with different forms of society. The first with Christian paganism, which is the way he might have described his contemporary Copenhagen. The second with Greek and Oriental cultures, and as mentioned, the third with Judaism. But having described and differentiated anxiety, Vigilius finishes the concept of anxiety by explaining why anxiety can be beneficial to us in our practical lives, and indeed why it's essential to salvation. Again, there are three ways that anxiety can aid us. First, it allows us to better imagine possibilities in our lives, and therefore understand and appreciate the relationship between possibility and actuality. Through choice, I can elect possibilities that do not yet exist and make what was formerly only possible actual. This allows us to make choices, and make our choices at a higher level than the choices of the immediate, of the here and of the now. Second, anxiety allows us to imagine an infinity of possible future journeys. Anxiety in this way makes us what Vigilius calls pupils of possibility. And, as he writes, if you take a pupil of possibility and place him in the middle of the Jutland heath, where no event takes place, or where the greatest event is a grouse flying up noisily, he will experience everything more perfectly, more accurately, more thoroughly than the man who has received the applause on the stage of world history, if that man is not a pupil of possibility. Finally, anxiety can provide us with the insight that our own guilt, as Vigilius has pointed out in the front of the book, is not a finite guilt, but rather is very much an infinite guilt related to Adam as man. Once we take up the task to accept the obligation of self-discovery of the spirit, we lose our innocence, the innocence that Adam had, and we must live with infinite, not just specific and finite, guilt. There is no going back to innocence, and therefore no escape from anxiety. Vigilius tells us that this is not cause for despair, however, but rather for hope. And indeed, it allows us to better understand our need for atonement. But then the book ends, with no telling us how we are supposed to find this, not the need for despair. For that, we need to turn to sickness unto death. Howard Hong writes that the concept of anxiety and sickness unto death may be regarded as a two-stage explication. Both are based on the concept of man as synthesis of finite and infinite, the temporal and the eternal. Tillich writes, there are two writings which every theologian must read. Both are comparably short, the concept of dread and sickness unto death. But it is important to distinguish what Kierkegaard was doing in the two books. As the Georges Arbach point out, sickness unto death is in no sense a revised version of the concept of anxiety. Anxiety is treated in the concept of anxiety as the very mark of humanness under the responsibility of freedom. Despair, as treated in sickness unto death, is the dreadful sickness that befalls spirit through the wrong use of freedom. To understand why we need not despair, then, we have to turn to sickness unto death, an explicitly Christian rather than psychological text, and a highly religious text at that, written by Anticlimacus. Anticlimacus tells us that despair is a sickness of the spirit, of the self, and accordingly can take three forms. In despair, not to be conscious of having a self, in despair, not to will to be oneself, and in despair, to will to be oneself. Unlike innocence, then, which precedes anxiety, despair follows anxiety. But not really in the form of spiritlessness, because it involves cunning and deception, which we must invoke as a willful ignorance to ignore one's task, to become oneself. While there are several kinds of despair, the worst kind, according to Anticlimacus, is the despair before God, or the person who refuses to be himself, and in doing so is defiantly willing to be a self independent from God. He tells us there are 4 ways we can overcome the despair, the first 3 of which are going to be failures, and they all involve anxiety. The first is doing the best we can. The second is despairing over Christ's forgiveness of sin by not accepting his forgiveness. And the third is rejecting Christianity as untrue. As I said, they all end in failure. Indeed, the only way, Anticlimacus tells us, that we can avoid or overcome despair is to accept Christ's claim that he is both God and man, and that through him comes forgiveness of sin. In making this choice, as in all others, we must be in anxiety. So let's consider what anxiety means in all of its various forms relative to what Vigilius calls the dizziness of freedom. He writes, anxiety can be compared with dizziness. He whose eye happens to look into the yawning abyss becomes dizzy. But what is the reason for this? It is just as much in his own eye as in the abyss, for suppose he had not looked down. Hence, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom that emerges when the spirit wants to posit the synthesis and freedom looks down into its own possibility, laying hold to finiteness to support itself. So just as we framed the exegesis of Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety within the conception of Kantian anxiety, I'd like to frame Kierkegaard's understanding of freedom with Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty. Berlin famously challenged the then conventional wisdom of liberalism by showing that a strong distinction needs to be marked between two rival and incommensurable concepts of liberty, which he labels as positive and negative. When he discusses negative liberty, he gives an account that must be given of any claim about freedom if it's to be intelligible. Where Berlin has something challenging to add is when he goes beyond the traditional argument and talks about positive liberty. But in his attempt to develop positive liberty in that essay, he's dogged by several false starts. He begins by suggesting that whereas negative liberty is freedom from constraint, positive liberty is freedom to choose or to select a certain form of life. But this distinction cannot be used to disclose two different concepts of liberty, if only because all cases of negative liberty are at once cases in which I am free from the constraint of being and allowed to choose, and in consequence of that, free to act as I wish and I choose. Berlin next suggests the positive sense of liberty resides in being the master of oneself as opposed to being acted on by external forces. This too, he admits, fails to isolate a separate concept of positive liberty. For in the situation where I am free to act in virtue of not being hindered by external forces is, by his own analysis, the situation of someone in possession of their liberty in the ordinary negative sense. Berlin finally, or penultimately, argues that maybe the concern here is not being the master, but rather being interested in a different notion of mastering oneself. When he first employs this formula, he refers to it as the thought of obstacles to our capacity to act freely, or it might be internal rather than external to ourselves, and that we need to free ourselves from these psychological constraints if we are to behave autonomously. But this too fails, as he points out. It doesn't capture a separate concept of positive liberty. All it does is extend constraint to internal rather than external things. So in his ultimate claim, however, he says that to make about what we want to say about self-mastery is different and more convincing because we want to give a positive content to the idea of liberty as the freedom of human agents that have managed most fully to become themselves. So freedom is equated not with self-mastery, but rather with self-realization. The positive concept is thus that which Berlin finally summarizes: whatever is the true goal of man must be identical with his freedom. Now, Berlin nowhere, to the best of my knowledge, engages with Kierkegaard in any of his important essays or his books, and yet he writes as if he is rehearsing the Kierkegaard we have just engaged in the concept of anxiety. That Kierkegaard also acknowledges negative freedom, or the freedom passed down from Locke's second treatise, that give us the freedom of press, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, and all the associated freedoms that comprise our contemporary notions of liberty. But he doesn't understand, or doesn't think negative freedom is very important, because it's merely the manifestation for Kierkegaard of every human being, and that human being's ability to have free choice. And that recognition of that free choice by the state or the society or the church, for that matter, is nothing unique to Kierkegaard. In either or, Kierkegaard actually writes, I am by no means confusing free choice with true positive freedom. But there's another freedom for Kierkegaard that's more fundamental than this. The freedom that is discovered, as Vigilius writes, when we turn inward and examine ourselves. Freedom to know of himself that he is free. This, by the way, is separate and beyond the freedom of choice, and it's an ontological, or I will argue, a metaphysical statement about myself. I am freedom. This is, by the way, what Alistair MacIntyre never understood when he conflated freedom of choice with the freedom to self-actualize. According to Kierkegaard, if we realize that we are free to choose, and then choose freedom, which is to say that the future possibility is true to ourselves, in choosing the good over the evil, then we are self-actualizing, which he literally means as making the possibilities of our future actual. Without bringing in all of the Heideggerian baggage, if we are authentic in our choices, we are freedom. While this may be enough to establish Kierkegaard's liberal credentials, he does develop one further form of freedom that incorporates revelation and the freedom of Christ, who, as our freedom, liberates us from our sins and allows for the possibility of self-actualization beyond sin. Interestingly, as I read it, in a certain way, Christ's freedom almost reverts to the elementary freedom or the negative freedom, but it only can happen after revelation. But let's sum up our discussion of freedom using Kierkegaard's words himself from Sickness Unto Death, where he concludes, the self is composed of infinitude and finitude, but synthesis is a relationship, and it is a relationship which, though it is derived, relates itself to itself, which means freedom. The self is freedom, but freedom is the dialectical element in terms of possibility and necessity. So what does this all mean for the way we think about entrepreneurship, or the way that Schumpeter, for example, described the entrepreneur? Maybe not much, but let's throw out a couple of things and see if we can create a parallel and maybe some place for some future work. According to Schumpeter, the entrepreneur is someone who carries out new combinations, introducing new products, processes, identifying new export markets, sources of supply, or creating new types of organization. Old industries, when the entrepreneur brings his major innovations into markets, are going to be challenged, because the entrepreneur for Schumpeter is a bit of a hero. He's someone who is motivated by the dream and the will to found a private kingdom, the will to conquer, the impulse to fight, to prove oneself superior to others, and to experience the joy of creating. When he brings these innovations in, and these old industries become obsolete, Schumpeter calls this creative destruction. As the new industries compete with the established ones for labor, materials, and investment goods, they drive up the prices of resources. The old industries cannot pass on their higher costs because demand is switching to new products, and therefore they decline. The new ones expand because of imitators who, with optimistic profit expectations based on the innovator's initial success, continue to imitate him. Eventually, overcapacity depresses profits, halts investment, but innovation and invention continue, and eventually there's a sufficient stock of unexploited inventions to encourage those courageous entrepreneurs to begin innovation yet again. So in this way, Schumpeter uses the entrepreneur to explain structural change, economic growth, the business cycle, all of which are a combination of both economic and psychological ideas. But Schumpeter did not seek to ground his entrepreneur metaphysically in freedom, and perhaps that might have painted a more robust picture of him. Perhaps we might even think that the warnings of capitalism, socialism, and democracy might have been different had the entrepreneur also been defined as one of Kierkegaard's wayfarers on the journey to selfhood. This possibility is worth more than just a passing thought, and may indeed be very important to the future of capitalism. Turning to Knight and Knightian uncertainty, and Amar has already touched on this, so we can scrunch it down a little bit. Knight's entrepreneur was far less exalted than Schumpeter's, and defined less as an innovator and more as a man who uniquely underwrote uncertainty as opposed to the more easily insurable risks that Amar talked about and differentiated from uncertainty. The entrepreneur is unique, to be sure, and his taking on of uncertainty makes him uniquely entitled to a profit rather than merely a wage. Knight writes in Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, let us consider first a simple case of unique and undivided exercise of the function of the entrepreneur, the control and uncertainty bearing all being concentrated in the same individual, under the assumption that outsiders, whether employed by him or not, have neither opinion upon nor interest in the question of his competence. It will further simplify the problem if we begin by assuming that this is the only type of entrepreneur in our society. So while not as heroic as Schumpeter's entrepreneur, in bearing the uncertainty, the entrepreneur must wrestle with the same kind of thing, same kind of ambiguity that we all must wrestle with in Kierkegaard's anxiety. Knight never seeks to connect the entrepreneur, who exclusively bears uncertainty in our economy, however, with the notion of freedom. Other than that, he ought to be free to choose, free to contract what is required to realize his economic objectives. So he's free to set wages for labor. He's free to set the price of his product. But those are relatively small freedoms when you consider the freedoms that Kierkegaard was talking about. We might ask ourselves, would Knight's entrepreneur have been more convincing had he had a metaphysical dimension? Knight himself seems to be of two minds here. He hinted at the idea of exploring metaphysics of a kind when he wrote, foreshadowing Habermas, and in very Kierkegaardian terms, the basic error or heresy of modern civilization that represents a kind of original sin is this: the spirit of discussion is the essence of the scientific spirit, but the antithesis of the scientific method. The utilitarian pragmatic philosophy involves the fatal confusion of carrying the scientific method, rather than the spirit, into social studies. Now, that's the kind of refreshing epiphanies that we all had when we first read, and Amar talked about them when we first read Frank Knight. But Frank Knight has another side as well, which earns him, perhaps more so, the title to the grandfather of the Chicago School. And elsewhere in Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, he writes, when discussing the summary he just gave of his epistemology, if you will, he says, this is a superficial sketch of the theory of knowledge, and it has not seemed important to give extensive reference to the philosophical literature. It will be evident that the doctrine expounded here is a foundation or a pragmatic view with some reservations. By way of further reservation, we should point out that the tone of the discussion merely results from the fact that it is a function of consciousness and knowledge in relation to conduct that we're interested in. And the text must not be taken as expressing any view whatsoever as to the ultimate nature of reality or any other philosophical position. The writer, Knight writes, referring to himself, is in fact a radical empiricist in logic, which is to say, as far as theoretical reason is concerned, an agnostic on all questions beyond the fairly immediate facts of experience. That really doesn't speak to Kierkegaard. And certainly when it comes to religion, particularly Christianity, Knight goes beyond agnosticism and is downright antagonistic. If we go to his 1939 essay on the ethics and economic reform, he writes, there is little to be found in Christianity in the way of moral principles or ideals of, I'll wrap this up, which can serve for ethical guidance of deliberate political action. Indeed, evil rather than good seems the likely result from any appeal to Christian religious and moral teachings in connection with the problems of social action. Now, clearly, Frank Knight was not going to read Kierkegaard, but that doesn't mean that we can't simultaneously read Schumpeter, Frank Knight, and Kierkegaard and try and find a better way to understand how the entrepreneur behaves in our economy, underwrites uncertainty, and expresses freedom. Thank you very much.
This is going to be quite short. First of all, I wanted to say thank you, Mark, for inviting someone like myself. I do think no one's, because Kierkegaard's writing falls in a lot of different places, that it hasn't been looked at as art particularly. but I think we can all agree that he did achieve literature. So I mean, there are times when forms are very respected and art falls within those, and there are times when it doesn't, and I think Kierkegaard is a time when it doesn't. So I do think art comes from a very connectedness to emotions, the emotional life, and certainly Kierkegaard gets an A+ in that score. But I also very much delighted hearing the name Asger Jorn. How many people in this room have ever heard the name Asger Jorn? 1, 2, yeah. I don't know how we're going to celebrate his birthday party next year if people haven't heard of him. He's one of my absolute heroes, and I liked very much hearing some of how he formed his work, and I intend myself to attend the birthday party if no one else does next time. And then I kind of also wanted to talk about in that art sense that we have I find, although there are these distinctions, the early Kierkegaard and the late Kierkegaard and all of that, that I somehow find this amazing repetition of ideas that go through and come back and recirculate. And I was just thinking that because he's really contemporary and writing at the same time as Wagner, this is sort of the way Wagner created music out of a story and made the light motif part of musical literature, has a similarity with Kierkegaard. And so that sets me to the notion of just looking at the individual. And so I wrote this little piece. Not long ago, I visited Hamburg to write about another great individualist, the artist Philipp Otto Runge. On the 200th anniversary of his birth, he received the full dose of the Romantic conviction, which I feel Hegel only wrote about. Another devout Christian, Runge synthesized. And one can't forget our homegrown individualist Henry David Thoreau, though more inspired by nature than the city. And I would also like to remember the great Japanese philosopher Nishida Kitaro, founder of the Kyoto School, and also Mahatma Gandhi. And I myself have written, art is not so much an individual pursuit as it is a pursuit of the individual. That we are celebrating the birthday of an individual bears witness to individualism. Kierkegaard did not just live to write, he wrote to live. What he recommended to others, he recommended to himself. I might like to say he progressed a spiritual journey, much the same as the one Runge professed. Both found the light as individuals highly unlikely by following good anxiety. Though not as elevated as, say, the 13th century Zen priest Dogon, who solved necessity and speech in other ways, the clock's ticking backwards, Indra in Tivoli. That's because I just returned from India, and I really loved the comments on the Vedism. So then just quickly, I'm going to read some passages. The first one is from this man Runge, who I'm sure hardly anybody in this room knows who I'm talking about. Is that true? Okay, so let him speak for himself. The living coherence of a pure work of art is born directly from the overflowing richness of feeling. The work of art, however, derives its completion from a reflection of the coherence of the exterior form with the most inner emotion. By the way, Runge is the first generation after Kant, so we're talking about 1805 when he wrote this. If then feeling and reflection in a work of art permeate each other most intimately, it will stir the crude man, the dilettante, and the artist, each in his own way. Then I'm going to just read this. This is from the, and thank you for the pointing out the dread, the use, because I think this one sentence quote works even better with the use of dread than anxiety. Anyway, therefore, he who in relation to guilt is educated by anxiety will rest only in the capital A, atonement. And then I'd like to just read a little thing from Thoreau. Many go to Europe to finish their education, and when they have returned, their friends remark that the most they have acquired is a correct pronunciation of English. It is a premature hardening, but hollowing of the shell. They become valuable utensils of the gourd kind, but have no palatable and nutritious inside. Instead of acquiring nutritious and palatable qualities to their pulp, it is all absorbed into a prematurely hardened shell. They went away squashes, and they return gourds. They are all expressed or squeezed out. Their essential oil is gone. And then a quick jump to two contemporary poets. One, Charles Bernstein. Sometimes I am disturbed even by my ability to function. I feel at times a shell of myself, a shell of a shell of myself. And then my wife, who hates both Thoreau and Kierkegaard, I go over an event as it develops beyond anxiety, at whether a blank is in my mind and red rock in the world, or whether transparency is landscape. Thank you.
I certainly find it a useful metaphor, and I like. Well, I like the idea that one can, and I think this is something I'm going to turn it over to Amar in a second. I like the idea that one can abstract from, and Amar started to make this distinction when he was up here, models and hypotheses and theories that constitute economics. And then the actual free human beings who are out there in markets, innovating, assuming risks, assuming uncertainty. Amar has written extensively on entrepreneurs, and he uses words such as venturesome, adventurer. They're very poetic sort of words. They don't lend themselves to the language of finance or economics. So I think it's a better question for Amar.
That was the second thing matter that I would have said. So I think there is a both Knight and Keynes spoke of uncertainty, but, and on the surface they look quite similar, but there are significant differences, and the differences are which are actually quite relevant today. One is for Knight, this kind of uncertainty was ubiquitous. It's uncertainty about whether we should stay with properties or not, what we should order of the menu. In each instance, if you never ordered off the menu before, you have no clue what the sale will be. For Keynes, this kind of uncertainty was once in a lifetime, a really radical attempt, and so on and so forth. So it's the day-to-day functioning and the day-to-day entrepreneurship which exists in life does not exist in Keynes. Moreover, this would also be relevant. Knight implies a leap into the dark when confronted with the fact of whatever situation we're in, and unlikely situation we've been in before. With Keynes, he fudges more or less by saying that even when faced with situations where there's no basis for making any judgment, we simply extrapolate. And so there is no leap into the dark in Knight. All there is possibly a dialing up of the degree to which we extrapolate or not on a mass basis, depending on what the state of the atmosphere is. And these two things, I think, although the surface Knight and Keynes look similar, they're not.
Richard, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about yourself as an artist. I think you're absolutely right in characterizing Kierkegaard an artist. The last time we met, we spent most of the time talking about Hegel. And it's always seemed to me that one way to distinguish different strands of philosophers is philosophers on the one hand who take a certain kind of science as their model, philosophers who take a certain kind of art as their model. Hegel certainly understood philosophy as science, distance from, not what we mean by science today, but nonetheless a certain kind of systematicity to build science. Kierkegaard was self-consciously opposing his position against that. The appropriation of art by artists is always a complicated process. You want to go from literary philosophy, philosophical literature, to that of visual art. So can you share with us a little bit how a figure like Kierkegaard shapes your own artistic vision?
Is this working? I guess it is, yeah. It's strange. Felt today a lot of what's been said on the psychological side of things. It's so absorbed that I find, and it's absorbed in a way I face every day in trying to do my work, you know, which is, I think the artist has to get to a creative energy, inspiration rules rather than idea, but a lot of I mean, I don't know, the Nordic way of describing a landscape it has I'm thinking of Swedenborg, for example, and that you know, there's always this question of where is the figure in the landscape? You know, where does that sit? And but okay, so I'm supposed to talk about myself. That is the most difficult thing, I guess, you know, to do. When I first read Kierkegaard, and you know, I'd gone through all the Sunday schools and the Christian upbringing, and very strictly, I felt that this was a real bond of someone who had a lot of the same struggles. And I must say, I am struggling with, I think, a lot of the same things he was struggling with. However, I've come to a point where I feel the Western culture, the ideas that form or are behind our acts, including our thoughts, are much more formed by the Greek discovery of the deductive reasoning, and what is very often missed, I think, the opposite side, but it's also connected in the sense that the Greeks invented a concept of approach to art as well as an aesthetic, and those two then attempted to find each other, and they found each other in this brilliant period at the end of the Roman Republic with Virgil, and there's an extremely important visual culture at the same time that, you know, just walking here this morning, I found so many examples. I'm looking across the street and I can see the aesthetic of that Augustan period is shaped so many of our thoughts of what civilization is, and that the moment the overlap occurred between the aesthetic and the approach to art, and that only lasted a minute. With great positive energy, there was a negative energy that came in and did everything to destroy it, and that, I'm sorry to say, was Christianity. You know, and I am struggling. My struggle now is to regain but in Kierkegaard's case, I think this is another important point, because the last books, you feel that he really did achieve through synthesis, through everything that he's writing about, he nevertheless found a positive. He went through all the negativity of the social form. I'm not talking. I'm talking about the, of course, the organized part of Christianity, and he did free all of us up, and I think that's. If he hadn't done that, and it's, I mean, the amazing thing, it's available for everyone to read, that he wouldn't be celebrated, he wouldn't have the importance in the world. And so I just like to, okay, so maybe Mark, to answer your question, that I'm actually trying to do the same thing that he's done, and whether I have an exhibition in Japan or I'm making fabric in India, it's always in this I mean, like also at this conference, I think that we've been developed, I mean, at first I thought it was a passage from the psychological man to the psychological animal to the economic animal. But I now see that the synthesis of the two is, someone used the phrase, the future of capitalism is once one can do that, there's a special condition reached, and it's, you know, we can, for me, we can have our Augustan aesthetics. You see those urns that are on the decorating the building across the street? They can be interpreted as visual phenomenon. They can be interpreted at least 10 different ways, and that means that meaning is available in much more ways than the individual could think to have access, and that it's a way that we can open and enrich and grow, and so I mean I actually think, because you know, if we spend more time looking at what Kierkegaard actually achieved and how he achieved it, we'd be better off. You know.
I'm wondering if some people could speak to the question you brought up at the beginning, which is how, we've sort of established that anxiety can be helpful and it can be paralyzing. It can open up possibilities and it can prevent us from taking them. So how can Kierkegaard help us think about healthy anxiety, you might want to say, a productive anxiety, a generative anxiety, and what kind of practices do we need to engage in to create the context within which anxiety can be that way? I was actually going to ask
Well, I actually think that the when you, I mean, the sufferer, you know, experiences the kind of anxiety that's possible. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, all of it, we're constantly living in front of a hostile nature. You know, nature is, I mean, any time a meteor can come and smash us off the face of the earth. I mean, that's like a given. And but if in my understanding, I love this word atonement. You know, it's because you know, I think you're the only person who I mean, I heard the word sin spoken of, and it's a really interesting word. I mean, Kierkegaard says that the only way. I mean, all my life I've wondered what is sin, you know, but he says the only way is through revelation from God. You know, that's the only way you'll ever know what sin is. You know, and then you get atonement. You know, on top of that, but it is, you know, once one takes the darkest of the damaging anxieties, the destructive anxieties, to a point where there's no other solution than to turn, 180 degrees in the opposite direction. What again in his writing, I mean, because this is one of my thoughts, that because the writing tends to be read in a very academic context, and I think that's not the best. I mean, I like to read it. I just like to pretend I'm in Tivoli Gardens, because he's just in love with thoughts, and you just go here and wow, you go there and wow, and he's just. So like atonement is just one of the things that you'd see at the Tivoli Gardens, and like it should, it's not like, oh, I mean, how am I going to rest, all that. It's just, oh boy, let's, pay the, 10 cents and get on that ride, I mean, that's, and, he's valuable. I mean, you talk about like a philosopher, it's a question if he's, performs everything that a philosopher is expected to perform, and that's fine, but then read him as he, with the life and the dimensionality that he has put into the words, and that also means to follow along. He's this is also the question of artists who, they're very often thought egocentric and slightly mad and all those things. But if unless you follow the whole book of anxiety brings you to the point. There's only one point in the whole book, and that's how to use good anxiety. And that's when it's a what do they call it, a do-it-yourselfer, sort of thing.